Good evening and welcome to another session of the D91 webinars. Today we will be looking at Concur and how to use it. I'd like to introduce you to our District Finance Manager, Stuart Marshall, and he will be taking you through today's session. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to see all of you this evening. So, as Debbie mentioned, today we're going to be focusing on Concur. And just to say right from the top that if there are any questions as we go through this, then please don't hesitate to raise a hand and we can address any queries as we go. Otherwise, we'll have a time available at the end of the session for questions. So the agenda for today, we're going to be covering these 6 items. We're going to start with a little bit about the background. So what is Concur? What do we use it for? How are users set up? And probably for this group, the most important thing, how are user requests submitted? Then one of the key focuses is going to be around the item number 3, registration and the first login, because I know this has been an issue for some members because it's got relatively complex because of the addition of the 2-factor authentication, which has come into play for this Toastmasters year. Then we'll talk about what user profile details you need to update when you're first logging into Concur. Then we'll go back to item 5 just to make sure everyone's clear that having gone through that registration process, what a standard login would look like thereafter. And then we will finish up on item number 6, which is probably what everyone most wants to know, which is how to submit an expense claim after you've been through all of the setup. So what is Concur? Concur is basically an expense management system. Some people may have used it in their day jobs, but it's the system used by Toastmasters International for both the submission of expense claims, but also the approval process. Just for convenience, I've included the link simply concurrsolutions.com to access the platform. And in terms of user requests and setup, there's a real key message that I wanted to share here, which is I don't know whether everyone in the Toastmasters community is aware of this, but all Toastmasters members are not automatically set up on Concur by default. It's not something that every member across the district automatically will be able to access. The exception to that rule is the district executive committee, so that's DLT, and for those division directors and area directors, all of that group are set up, but only at the start of the relevant Toastmasters term. But I think the key thing, particularly when it comes into this period now where incentives are starting to be awarded, I want to make it really clear for everyone and to share between your communities that club officers and the club members, as I said, are not set up as Concur users by default. So access must be requested on an as required basis. And generally that might be, for example, if a club qualifies for an incentive award, then I'd expect that either the president or perhaps the secretary or somebody from the club would request to be set up as a user so that they can basically claim that incentive award. Now, what does that process look like? It's relatively straightforward. All it involves is sending an email to the District 91 finance manager, so myself at the current time, and providing the information that's highlighted in the yellow box. So just some real fundamentals: first and last name, your Toastmasters membership ID, the email address. And the important thing about that is it must be the email address that was used by that member when they registered for Toastmasters. Those email addresses must match. Then the role, either club president or treasurer, for example, and then the club name and country of residence, which obviously for the vast majority of our region is going to be UK. The last point I want to highlight here is that although I, in my capacity as finance manager, will submit those user requests to World HQ, we are reliant on World HQ to activate and create the members, which can take time depending on the time of year, etc. But I will always confirm back to the users when WHQ lets me know that the user in question has been activated. Okay, so this is probably where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. It is a relatively convoluted process, unfortunately. As I said, we've had the addition of the two-factor authentication, which has further complicated this process. But what I've tried to do is provide screenshots across the entire user journey. So with the intent that that should make it easier to follow. So where do we start then? We log on to concursolutions.com. The first thing you're going to be asked for here is your username. Your Concur username is your member ID at toastmasters.org, as indicated in the red text on the left. Now, the important thing to note here is that that member ID must be 8 digits long. And for example, my member ID, which is shown here as an example, that is 8 digits long, so I can use it as it is. If you're a member, and I think certain members who might have been at Toastmasters for longer than I have, if your member ID is only 7 digits, then you would add a 0 to the start of your username. As the example in the bottom left here, if your username is 123456 then you would add a 0 to the front of that in order to log in. This is just how World HQ sets up these usernames for consistency. So with that entered, click next, and then you will have an option to either sign in with an email link or use your password. In general, I'd suggest using that SAP Concur password option, the top button. And then you get to this screen, the first screen on the left here, where you're asked to enter your password. Now, on a first login, you don't have a password, so you would use the forgot password option as circled here. And then again, in the forgot password window, you would re-enter your username, although I think it actually is automatically populated, and then you hit send. And hitting send at this point will send an email, and just to emphasize again, send it to the email address that was used to register with Toastmasters, with full instructions on how to reset the password. So at that point, you'd go into your email account and look out for that email from Concur. So once you've gone through that process to reset the password, you would come back to restart the sign-in process. So, and I've repeated the screens here just so there's nothing missing in the whole process. So again, enter your username, click next. On the next sign-in page, choose SAP Concur password again. Now it's different this time because obviously at this point you've now got your password. So you would enter your password, hit next again, and then it's at this point that, as I said, on the first registration attempt, first login attempt, you would have to set up your two-factor authentication. Now, two-factor authentication, for those who don't know it by that name, is basically where you have to enter a passcode that is automatically generated by an authenticator app. So set up two-factor authentication. Once you've got to this point, it automatically again sends you another email to your email that was used for registering with Toastmasters that should look something, well, exactly like this, this example here. So it comes from the address noreply@concur.com. And you basically just select set up two-factor authentication and kick off the process. So it again takes you back to the start of the sign-in process, which you're becoming familiar with now. Enter username, select SAP Concur password, enter your password, and then you get this new screen which gives instructions in 2 steps in terms of how to set up your two-factor authentication. And I think this is perhaps one of the areas which is confusing for people that might not have done something similar before. Because at this point, as step 1 says, you have to go and download an authenticator app, such as Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator, or whoever else you might want to use. The example we have here is downloading the Google Authenticator app. So this is what the symbol looks like. It's a star in the traditional Google colors of blue, red, green, and yellow. You can either download this in the Apple Store as shown in these screenshots, but it's obviously available for Android devices as well through Google Play. So you go to your relevant app store, you search for the Google Authenticator. I'd suggest following Google Authenticator unless there's a very good reason for wanting to use an alternative. You then download that app and then go through the setup of the app for the first time, which is basically selecting Get Started at the bottom. And then on the next screen, which is the third graphic on the right, you either have an option to sign in with your Google account, or you can just use the app without an account. So adding Concur within the authenticator, firstly, you select add a code, and then on the next screen, you select the option scan a QR code. Now, if you haven't used that functionality before, basically what it does is it launches the camera app on your device, on your mobile phone. And in the next screen, you can see how it asks for you to access, just approve access to the camera. So you'd hit OK. Now you come back, you might remember we saw this screen earlier and it had a QR code on it. What you do from within the Authenticator app is scan this QR code, and that will automatically add it to your Authenticator app. Unfortunately, I can't show an image of what it looks like because of the security nature of the app. It doesn't allow you to take screenshots. But basically, I'm not sure if I can show it, whether it appears. No, I don't think it's going to appear, unfortunately. But basically, it appears within the app a 6-digit authenticator code that is periodically updated, a bit like you might have used for banking logins. If anyone had like a card reader, it's a similar visual approach to that. So you would then enter that 6-digit authentication code, which is shown in the right-hand image. And all being well, you will successfully be logged in and you will arrive at the Concur landing page, which is shown here. So, having navigated that process, you are in Concur for the first time. And the next part is completing your user profile and just checking the details within your profile. So there's 3 main elements. You just need to go in, check your personal information and add your title. The key bit is the expense settings, where you have to update the bank information. Obviously, that's critical. You basically add in the bank information that is then used by Toastmasters International to reimburse you for any expenses. And then finally, update some system settings, including language and your preferred date or time format. So as you can see from the image, you basically select the button in the top right, which is made up of your initials, and then select profile settings. This takes you through to this screen where you can access all of the different categories of information. As I said, the first step is to complete personal information. So I think it automatically populates your name details here, but you can validate them and add in your title as indicated by the red box highlighting that field. Step 2, as I said, the key part of this setup of your user profile. This is where you would enter the details of the bank that you want the money sent back to. So if you make a claim, whether it's for mileage or whether it's for incentives or any other type of expense, you would enter the bank code. So the standard type of things, account number and sort code, bank name, etc., etc. And then finally, you can update the system settings, which you might want to put the default language into English UK, and you've got some flexibility over changing date and time format and time zone. But just to re-emphasize, the key part of the user profile is ensuring those bank details are correct, because World HQ are basically going to use those details to send you your reimbursed expense claim values. Right, so now you're set up. Maybe you don't have an expense at that time, so you've gone away, and then at some point in the future you need to come back and log in, and it's a lot more straightforward having gone through that setup process of initial registration, setting up the two-factor authentication, etc. So now, just as a user who's accessed the system before, this is the standard login journey. Again, back to concursolutions.com. Select SAP Concur password as your sign-in method. Enter your password. You now have a new screen for two-factor authentication. So you would open the Authenticator app and type in the 6-digit code that is currently displayed, and then you're back in. Simple once you've set it up. Okay, so how do you submit an expense claim once you're set up as a user? I think this is the part of the functionality that is probably going to be most used by everybody. So we will use the remainder of the time to focus in this area. Just in terms of the high-level process, just to give everyone an indication before we go into details, when you get into the system, you basically click on Start a Report. A report is effectively a new expense claim. The report name, and if you take away one piece of information from this webinar, then please let it be this, because one of the key issues that we've had with the way expenses have been claimed is people not adhering to the specified Toastmasters format for report names. And it was actually brought up as an audit review point from the prior year. So it's a hot topic that we really need to make sure we get right. So the report name must be in the format XX, which is your initials, dash D91 for the district, and then dash the year and month in two-digit format. So, for example, if I was submitting an expense, it would be SM-D91. If I'd requested it back in July, it would be 2024 for the current year, 07 for the month of July, and then another dash, and after that, just a quick high-level description of what the expense relates to. So, for example, here I've put dot expenses. That might be whatever material purchases, that might be a mileage claim, etc. But something that gives a clear indication what the report or the expense claim relates to. Once you've set up the report, you then go through the process of actually adding expenses to that report, which we'll go into in more detail, but effectively you choose the relevant code dependent on type, add all your details and descriptions of what it relates to, upload the relevant receipts, because all expenses must have a receipt attached, with the exception of mileage claims, which must have a map of the journey attached, clearly showing the mileage travelled. And then you might have multiple expenses on a single report, which we'll see shortly. So you would just go through that same stage 3 process multiple times till you'd added all the relevant expense lines. And then once it's complete, you'd just check it over and submit. Just a couple of notes to be aware of. All expense claims, whether it's division, level, area, or club, must be submitted via Concur. There is no other method of being reimbursed for your expense claims. And again, another really key piece of information on this slide: all claims must be made within 30 days of incurring the expense. And just again here, just to emphasize the fact that World HQ again do play a role in expense approval. The expense approval process consists of 3 stages. Firstly, it's going to come to me, and I'll be checking all of those things. Is the report name in the right format? Has it been coded correctly? If it's supposed to be an incentive, has the incentive code been chosen? If it's a mileage claim, has the mileage code been selected, etc., etc. Once I'm happy with it, it will be approved by me, and it will go on to the second stage of approval, which is our district director. Assuming he doesn't have any further queries and he's also happy, he will approve, and it will go to World HQ for the third and final stage of approval. Again, that is outside of our control. Myself and the district director, we can approve. We have no control on when World HQ may approve, but generally speaking, they are relatively quick at getting it done. And I guess when I say quick, it's generally within a week or so. So now we are in Concur itself. I've included a few screenshots just to show you the basics before we dive into the actual system itself. But when you start a new expense claim, as we talked about earlier, the first step is to click on the Start a Report grey button with the plus sign. This then brings up this create new report dialog box. And as we said before, and as I will continue to reiterate, you enter the report name here in that format that we've discussed, and you can see in the yellow box, it's again highlighted because, as I said again, it is really important. It is in that consistent format, and if it isn't, then it will be returned to you, and I'll expect you to update it in that format before it's resubmitted. So we've talked about report name, report date. You would enter the date the expense was incurred. And then in the comment box, I would suggest adding some details around the nature of the report and the nature of the claim in question. If it's a mileage claim, you might want to add in what club was visited, the date it was visited, and the reason it was visited. If you're claiming for a club incentive, then I would suggest adding what the incentive name is, when it was awarded, and the full club name on that you're claiming it on behalf of. And now we get to the details where you actually add in the individual expense lines that you're claiming for. So as you can see indicated by the red arrow, you select add expenses. On the next screen, you select new expenses in the tab at the top indicated by the red arrow again. And then below that, you'll see all of the different expense categories listed out that you can select from. Within this document, I have summarized some of the key expense categories, some of the ones that are most commonly used. So generally, you can see here at the top, travel expenses, often as you can see in the third column under expense type, is generally going to be either a mileage claim or it would be the 7066 code, public transport, rail, or in some rare cases, taxis. You will be distributing this deck, and it will also form part of the updated finance guide that will be available shortly. So not expecting anyone to remember all these codes, but useful to have as a bit of a cheat sheet on the common ones. And just glancing down that list, you'll see things like room rental, you'll see things like promotional materials, that or marketing materials, banners, etc., etc. And then again, probably key to highlight at the bottom, you'll see the expense code 7082, which is used for incentives alongside what's known as the reporting code, depending on what that incentive is. So for example, this was a list from last year. When we send this out, we'll update it for our incentives, but for example, Beat the Clock was down under a membership growth incentive type, which had a reporting code of 582. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this presentation and I'm going to log in to Concur so you can see how we actually add expenses. So give me a moment to share that Concur screen. There we go. So having seen this several times already through this webinar, you come to concursolutions.com. I add my username, click on next, choose SAP Concur password. I've got mine set to auto-populate my password because it's a personal computer that's locked and not available for anyone else's use. Click on next. It brings you to the two-factor authentication screen. Again, I've opened up my mobile phone Google Authenticator app, and it is currently showing a code that I will type in. So, no, and I hit sign in. And as you saw earlier, we arrive on the landing page here. So we'll go through the process of creating a new expense claim, a new report. So as I said earlier, we click on the big plus sign, start a report. We add the report name. As I said, my initials -D91. Let's say we're doing a new one, so it's 2024 October 10, and we'll just call it webinar test. The report date, because we're doing it today, it's automatically populated with the 13th of October. I'm going to imagine that it was today that I incurred this expense. In the comment, you add details and description of the nature of the expense claim. It's a free text field. You can add in, the more detail, the better. Makes it easier going through the approval process and makes our audit committee happy when they can see that it's clearly marked. You then go to the blue button in the bottom right, create report, which you saw in the screenshots. Again, hopefully this looks familiar. You click on adding an expense to that report that we've created. And as I mentioned, on the right-hand side at the top, you select new expense. And then it's in this list here where you can choose all of the different expense categories. So again, I really want to emphasize that the correct categorization of your expenses must be selected. If you've incurred a mileage expense, you should be selecting mileage, which is code 7062. If a mileage claim comes through under rail or other or any other code, it will automatically be rejected. And one of the key reasons for that is we've budgeted for all of these items against the relevant code, and we therefore need to mark our actual expenditure and record our actual expenditure with the correct code so that they can be marked off against each other. So let's say we're going to do a mileage claim, which is quite a typical example. It brings up this new expense panel, and you have to complete all of the items, as it says here, that are required fields, which is most of them. So I'll add in today's date, as I talked about. Maybe I went to visit a club this morning to give them an in-person guide to Concur. So I'm going to say, let's say it was face-to-face Concur training. If you've got a vendor, maybe you put where you made it's not as relevant, I guess, to mileage. You could enter the garage that you bought your fuel from. But the key thing here is you add in the city of purchase. I live in Bournemouth, down on the south coast, so I would enter Bournemouth here. By default, this is cash out of pocket expense. There's no other option, so leave that as it is. Then you would select amount. And this calculation is basically the number of miles that have been traveled multiplied by the allowance per mile, which for our Toastmasters year has been set at 45p, but that will be confirmed when the finance guide is issued shortly. So let's say I traveled 20 miles at 45p. it was a 10-mile journey to the club, 10 miles back, so that's 20 miles at 45p. I think my maths is correct. That would make it £9 that I'd be claiming. My currency as set up in my user profile is UK pound sterling, brought through from the bank details we talked about earlier. You would add in the from and to location. So I would have my home postcode, and let's say that I was going to the club in Ferndown, which is about 10 miles away. The number of miles, as we talked about, 20. The reporting code, you would select the relevant reporting code. Again, we'll include a list of these in the finance guide. But again, you can see the way they're categorized by role and type. So there should be a travel here. I would choose travel as a finance manager. Area or district director, division directors would choose travel, division director, or as I said, area director. So you select your reporting code. The event period is a default of NA. It's not used, but you have to enter NA in order to submit. And then the subsidiary is basically where does the expense sit in the district hierarchy. So if it's relevant to an area or a division, you would select that categorization. Otherwise, it would generally be district for most expenses. You can see the alternatives, that they're not going to be relevant to 99% of our district members, things like international travel or mid-year training. So select district unless you're an area or division director, where you would select the relevant category accordingly. Enter the full fuel receipt date. Let's say I got my fuel yesterday, and as I mentioned earlier, the other part of the key information that needs to be included is a receipt. So you go on the right-hand pane to add receipt, and I would check, just for an example, I'll attach an old map. I generally would recommend people just taking a screenshot of the route planner on Google Map, because it automatically brings up a clear dialog box showing the distance of the journey. So it's easy then from an approval perspective to say, right, if that journey is marked down as 10 miles, I double it, I multiply it by the rate and make sure that that gives me the amount that's being claimed for. I then save that expense, having gone through that whole process. If I've done it correctly, I'm going to get to this screen. If I haven't, it's going to prompt me to enter missing fields. Let's just say there's multiple expenses being added to this mileage claim. So I visited Ferndown today. Let's say I also did another trip. So same date, it pre-populates it with what you had before. So again, face-to-face Concur training. The amount, let's say this time it was a bit of a longer journey, so the amount is £50 here. I would add in, let's say I was going all the way to Salisbury to visit that club. I let's make this easy. If the amount was £45, I have travelled 100 miles. Again, same as before, subsidiary district, and I again add a receipt, or in this case a map, and save expense. Excuse me. Once I'm happy that I've added all my expenses correctly, I've got a correct report name, I have double checked all of my calculations, I've double checked that I've attached the relevant receipt or map, you would then submit the report for approval, which is the blue button in the top right. You're asked to just validate that you've read all of these items, that it's true and accurate, etc., and that receipt images have been attached. And I accept, and then submit report finally. And there you go. That report will then be shown in your report library, and you'll be able to go into it and go and see where it is in the process. So you can go and see what you entered for your report name, etc. If you realize afterwards that you've actually made an error in your submission, you can also come back to this point and recall the report, make some updates to it, and then resubmit. In this audit trail section under report details, you can also see where it is in the process. So it's submitted at this point. If I go back to my manage expenses window, you can also see here that it's been submitted, highlighted green, and is pending approval. So you can always check if the approval has been completed or not. Obviously, if you're wondering why mine says Debbie Williams, my first approval status, I clearly can't approve my own expenses, so Debbie would be the first approver before it again went to the district director and then World HQ. I just want to show one last example. So if we create another report, and I think this is important again because incentives have just started to be earned by some of our clubs. If you're claiming for a incentive, again, report name, initials, D99, D91, the year and the month that you're making the claim. But here I would suggest adding a note of what the incentive is, and if there's space, because it's limited, so actually I can't put any more information in, at least put the name of the incentive. In the comment box, you can say beat the clock incentive for your club. I'm a member of Hallmark Speakers, so I would put Hallmark Speakers in here. And I will create that report. Now, this time round, when I add an expense, I'm going to come down and look for incentives, that code that we talked about earlier, 7082. Again, I'm going to say that I earned that last week. So let's say I got that good news that I was successfully part of a club that was awarded that incentive last Wednesday. The business purpose would be, again, beat the clock, hallmark speakers, just to make it easy for a review. The amount, let's say it is a £40 incentive. The reporting code, let's have a look. Let's say it was a club growth incentive around membership growth. I would select the relevant code. Event period, as we talked about before, always NA. And then because it's a district awarded incentive, you would select district under subsidiary. The comment box can be used for any other information that you want to add. It might be best to put in your club name here, as you've got more characters and other relevant details when it was awarded. Perhaps anything that helps identify the claim and approve it without any issues. On this one, and this is a bit of an anomaly the way the system works, but with incentive claims, you have to attach at least 2 receipts, in inverted commas. You add at least 2 documents, I should say. You add a copy of the incentive voucher that you've been sent as part of being notified that you were awarded the incentive. But then you also must add a receipt showing the expense that you're claiming that incentive against. So in this case, if my beat the clock incentive was worth £40, then I'd have to add a receipt with a value for at least £40. And you'd be informed on the type of club expenses that could be claimed against. Generally, it's things like room hire for face-to-face meetings, Zoom, or any other kind of website costs, maybe promo materials or orders from Toastmasters International shop, things of that nature. But in order to add 2 receipts, it's as I mentioned, it's a bit of a convoluted approach again. You go to add in, I'm just going to pick any random thing that's just in here. So I'm going to select this. We all have to pretend that this is actually a incentive voucher. And now I would hit save because it only allows me to add 1 at a time. You come back to this manage expenses window, and now I would go back into that same expense just by clicking into it. And now at the bottom, I get an opportunity and an option to add additional expenses. So come in, same thing. This time I'd be choosing my expense, like I said, maybe a room hire receipt or something, or a Toastmasters order. Add that. It now shows 2 attachments, and I can then save the expense and submit. As we did previously. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I had hoped to leave a few more minutes for any initial questions, I just wanted to throw out the opportunity for anyone that wants to ask any questions at this point. I know we've covered quite a lot. It might be something, obviously we've recorded this, so there's an opportunity to watch it again. And that might be a good idea for some of these more complex items we have covered. But in the first instance, is there any questions from anyone? We've got a few minutes if there's anything anyone wants to ask.
There's one question from Alan Chapman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart,
excellent.
as normal, and thank you for help with Julie when she did hers. How long, I've got a couple of questions. How long will it take a club treasurer to get registered on Concur? I take it will be about over 4 weeks.
To be honest with you, Alan, and thanks for the question. It's a really good question. It's a bit difficult to give a definitive answer to. It generally should be within 10 to 14 days, I would suggest. That's what typically I've seen previously from World HQ. And that is where the bottleneck is usually, because let's say in your example, Alan, that the treasurer comes to me and says, right, these are my details. If they submit what we talked about, what we looked at earlier, all of those details that were covered in the yellow box out, if they've done that properly, I will immediately put that in the required format and send it to World HQ. World HQ, as I mentioned earlier, are responsible for creating and activating that user. It takes various amounts of time depending on what was going on at that point. So, for example, usually it would be within a couple of weeks, might even be quicker on occasion. If it's during a busy time, like a period end or like whilst the convention was on, for example, then it was taking much longer. So
Yeah.
I know not a perfect answer to your question, but I think probably
that's fine, Stuart. That's answered it. The second one, when you say the financial guide, I've got an old financial guide which was 21-22. Are you able to deliver it to the divisional directors so they can then send it out to us, or is it something we can get off of the D91 web?
It is on the D91 website as far as I'm aware. At the moment, the one that's up on the website is actually last year's one, which is still broadly correct for a lot of the key areas, covering things like what can area and division directors use their expenses and allocation for. But as I mentioned, we'll be updating that in the next probably couple of weeks. And at that point, we can certainly send the link round to all of the division and area directors for them to forward on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. We are actually out of time. We're 1 minute to 6. So can I just take this opportunity to thank you, Stuart, very much for your presentation today on Concur. I'm sure it's demystified a lot of the information and issues that people are having with the system. If there are any further questions, then please do get in touch separately. You can contact me, Debbie, at d91toastmasters.org.uk. Thank you very much. Please, would you provide feedback? There's a feedback form in the chat. And also, please join us for next week's webinar, which is talking about conflict resolution. So thank you very much.
Thanks all.